In the summer of 1879, 10,000 people called Bodie home. The streets churned with wagons, the saloons never closed. Gold flowed from the earth like water from a spring, and men arrived by the hundreds, convinced that fortune was waiting just beneath their boots. Today, the wind is the only thing that moves through Bodie. The buildings still stand, the church, the schoolhouse, the general store with canned goods still on the shelves. But no one lives here anymore. No children run between the wooden houses. No smoke rises from the chimneys. Bodie is a town frozen in the moment of its own abandonment, a place where ambition once burned so bright it could be seen for miles across the Nevada desert. And then, without ceremony, it went dark. This is the story of what happened in between. The rise of Bodie gold was discovered in the hills east of the Sierra Nevada in 1859. A man named Waterman Bodie found it first, though his name would be misspelled on every map and document that followed. He didn't live long enough to see what his discovery would become. He died in a blizzard that same winter, alone in the mountains he'd hoped would make him rich. But the gold remained. For years, the camp that bore his name was little more than a collection of tents and desperate men. The ore was difficult to extract. The winters were brutal. Most who came left quickly, defeated by the cold and the work. Bodie seemed destined to be just another forgotten stop on the long, failed search for Western wealth. Then, in 1876, everything changed. A cave-in at Republique Mine exposed a vein of gold so rich that news of it spread like fire across California and Nevada. Within months, the tents became wooden buildings. The wooden buildings became two-story hotels. The population swelled from a few hundred to several thousand, and still they came. They arrived from San Francisco and Sacramento, from failing farms in the Midwest, from mining camps in Colorado that had already gone bust. They came on horseback and on foot, carrying everything they owned. Most were young men, but families came too. Wives and children who believed that this time, in this place, life might finally deliver what it had promised. Bodie sat at 8,500 feet above sea level, perched on a high desert plateau where the wind never stopped and winter lasted half the year. It was not an easy place to live, but easy wasn't the point. The point was gold, and for a brief, brilliant window of time, Bodie had more of it than almost anywhere else in America. By 1879, Bodie was the second largest city in California. Life inside Bodie. The main street ran north to south, lined with saloons and gambling halls and hotels that never seemed to have enough rooms. There were 65 saloons in Bodie at its peak. Some were little more than a plank of wood balanced on two barrels. Others had velvet curtains and brass fixtures shipped all the way from the East Coast. The mines operated around the clock. Shifts changed every 8 hours. Men descended into the earth in iron cages, dropped hundreds of feet into tunnels lit only by candlelight. The work was dangerous. Cave-ins were common. Its explosions from poorly handled dynamite killed men every few months. But the pay was better than almost anywhere else, and that was enough to keep the shifts full. Above ground, the town had its own rhythm. There was a schoolhouse with 2 teachers and more than 100 students. A firehouse with a brass bell that rang for emergencies. A church where services were held every Sunday, though attendance was thin. There were photographers and tailors, and a man who sold ice cream in the summer. though summer in Bodie rarely lasted more than 6 weeks. The women of Bodie worked as hard as the men. They ran boarding houses and laundries. They cooked meals for miners who had no time or skill to feed themselves. Some worked in the saloons. Others took in sewing or sold baked goods from their front rooms. A few ran their own businesses outright. A rarity in most American towns, but common in places where survival mattered more than propriety. Children grew up fast in Bodie. They hauled water from the wells. They collected firewood from the hills. They learned early that nothing came easy, and that comfort was something other people in other places might enjoy, but not here. Still, there was a kind of life in Bodie that felt more alive than anywhere else. The streets were loud, the days were long. People made plans, they built things. They believed deeply and without irony that they were building something that would last. But Bodie was also violent. Shootings were common. Men settled disputes with fists and knives and pistols. The town had no official law enforcement for its first several years. And even when a constable was appointed, and his authority extended only as far as people were willing to respect it, murders happened in broad daylight. Bodies were found in alleys. The cemetery filled faster than anyone had expected. There was a saying in those years, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Bodie." Some claimed it was a joke. Others insisted it was a warning. The turning point. The end began, as it often does, quietly. In the early 1880s, the richest veins of gold began to thin. The ore that had been so easy to extract in the early years now required deeper digging, more equipment, more money. Small operators sold out to larger companies. The independent prospector, the man with a pickaxe and a dream, became a relic almost overnight. Bodie's mines were still productive, but the easy wealth was gone. What remained required industrial effort. With stamp mills pounded the ore day and night. Rail lines were built to move materials in and out. The work became mechanized, and with mechanization came efficiency. Fewer men were needed to pull the same amount of gold from the ground. As jobs disappeared, people left. Not all at once, not in a panic. Just a slow, steady departure. A family here, a single man there. Shops that had been busy began to see fewer customers. Hotels that had turned people away now had vacant rooms. Then came the fires. In 1882, a fire swept through the business district, destroying much of the main street. The town rebuilt, but it rebuilt smaller. There was less money, less optimism. The second fire, in 1892, burned even more. Some buildings were reconstructed, others were simply left as charred frames, and too expensive to restore in a town that was already dying. The railroad, which many believed would save Bodie, never came. Plans were drawn. Investors were courted. But in the end, the cost was too high and the potential return too uncertain. Bodie remained isolated, connected to the outside world only by rough roads that turned to mud in the spring and froze solid in the winter. By the turn of the century, Bodie's population had fallen to less than 1,000. The slow collapse. Leaving a town is not a single decision. It is 100 small decisions made over months and years. It is deciding not to repair a roof, not to restock a store, not to enroll a child in school for another year. In Bodie, those decisions accumulated. The mines continued to operate, but they employed fewer people and produced less gold. The companies that owned them were headquartered in San Francisco and New York. They saw Bodie not as a community, but as a resource to be extracted until it was no longer profitable. When the profits stopped, they stopped too. Families who had lived in Bodie for a decade or more packed their belongings and left for Reno, for Sacramento, for anywhere that offered steadier work and a future that didn't depend on what might or might not still be buried in the ground. The town's institutions began to close. The school held classes until 1932, though by the end there were only a handful of students. The post office remained open longer, a lifeline to the outside world for the few who stayed. But eventually, even that was deemed unnecessary. By 1940, fewer than 100 people lived in Bodie. The building stood empty. Windows broke. Roofs sagged under the weight of winter snow. Doors hung open, swinging in the wind. Inside, possessions remained where they had been left. Dishes on tables, clothes in closets, photographs on walls. People didn't abandon Bodie because they stopped caring. They abandoned it because staying no longer made sense. The gold was gone. The jobs were gone. The future was gone. What remained was just a collection of wooden buildings in a desert that had never been kind and never would be. What remains today? Bodie is a California State Historic Park now. It has been since 1962, preserved under a policy the Park Service calls arrested decay. Nothing is restored. Nothing is rebuilt. The town is maintained exactly as it was found, frozen in the moment of its abandonment. The visitors walk the same streets the miners walked. They peer through the windows of the saloons and the general store. They see the church where services were held, the schoolhouse where children learned to read, the cemetery where hundreds were buried, many without names. Inside the buildings, time has stopped. Bottles still sit on the bar. Tools hang on the walls of the workshops. A pool table remains in the corner of one saloon, the balls still scattered across the felt. There are jars of food on the shelves of the general store, their labels faded but still legible. In one house, a baby's crib sits in the corner of a bedroom, covered in dust. It is not a reconstruction. It is not a museum. It is Bodie itself, emptied of people but otherwise untouched. The Park Service does not explain why Bodie was never rebuilt or repurposed, and there is no need. The answer is in the wind and the silence and the miles of empty desert that surround it. Bodie exists where it does because gold was found there, and when the gold was gone, there was no reason for a town to exist at all. Other ghost towns were swallowed by progress. They were torn down or paved over or absorbed into newer settlements. Bodie was simply left behind, too remote to be useful, too expensive to dismantle, too fragile to survive without intervention, but too meaningful to destroy. So it remains, a monument to ambition, to the speed with which a community can be built and the speed with which it can be forgotten. Standing in Bodie today, it is hard to imagine the noise. The sound of 10,000 people living and working and arguing and dreaming, the rattle of wagon wheels on dirt streets, and the crack of gunfire, the laughter of children who had never seen a city and didn't know they were supposed to want anything other than what they had. All of that is gone now. What remains is the wind, moving through empty rooms and across streets no one walks anymore. Bodie is not unique. Across the American West, there are hundreds of towns like it. Places that rose fast and fell faster. Places where people believed they were building something permanent, only to discover that permanence was never the point. The point was the gold, and when the gold was gone, so was everything else. But Bodie endures in a way most of those towns do not as a living place, but as a reminder. of how quickly we build, how quickly we leave, how easily we forget. The people who lived in Bodie were not so different from anyone else. They wanted stability, and they wanted comfort. They wanted to believe that their work mattered, and that the place they called home would still be there for their children. For most of them, it wasn't. Bodie stands now as evidence of something we prefer not to think about, that the places we build are not guaranteed to last, that the communities we create can vanish as quickly as they appeared, that history is not a straight line of progress, but a series of beginnings and endings, most of which we will never see coming. The wind moves through Bodie the way it always has. The buildings creak, the dust settles, and the town, arrested in its decay, waits for nothing, because there is nothing left to wait for.